So perhaps you've also had this experience, but sometimes I go to therapy and I don't have much to talk about. I think this might be a good sign, or at least an indication that I'm doing all right. And I understand that people often seek out therapy when they're in crisis. In fact, it was a crisis that initially got me in that door. More on that later. But I believe that therapy is something we should go to even when things feel okay, kind of like seeing your doctor or going to the dentist. And so I go every week, even when there isn't anything weighing on my mind, which is how I found myself sitting across from my therapist on Monday playing the staring game. This is the only staring game that I know of that is billable to insurance. So after some silence, he asked me what initially brought me into therapy. Since we've only been working together for about a year, he didn't know when or why I first started seeing a therapist. Now, I've been in therapy for the better part of 2 decades, which is surprising because I don't feel old enough to have been a functioning adult for that long, but I am. And because it's hard to believe that the reasons that drew me into seeing the therapist so many years ago happened so long ago. Now, 2005 was a tough year marked by some major life transitions and unexpected losses that culminated with the death of my stepfather just a few months before my 18th birthday. Now, a word on what I'm going to be talking about today. Every year, synagogues across Chicago, in partnership with JCFS, Jewish Child and Family Services, chooses a Shabbat to highlight a topic related to our mental and emotional well-being from the Bima, from this place. And this year, the topic is estrangement, and this Shabbat is that Shabbat. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about that. And so this is like a bit of a content warning, which I'll be touching on the topics of death and estrangement. In Judaism, how we remember the dead can be traced all the way back to the actions of Abraham, the very first Jew. In Genesis, we read, Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. And Abraham came to eulogize his wife Sarah and weep for her. From this verse, the rabbis derive 2 practices for remembering the dead. First is hesped, or eulogy, where we share the praiseworthy qualities and notable achievements of an individual. And the second is bechi, or lament, where we mourn what was lost with their passing. When Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch several millennia later, he clarified that we must be honest when we are remembering the dead, but we should always err on the side of the positive. Or put another way, if you don't have anything nice to say, it's better to not say anything at all. Our tradition takes this injunction so seriously. We are told in 2 Samuel that when the people don't give King Saul a sufficiently respectful eulogy, and let's be honest, he was not a great monarch, they are struck with famine for 3 years. Remembering someone in a positive light can be a source of comfort for their loved ones, a way of ensuring that their memory is, in fact, for a blessing. Yehi zichrono livracha. People are complicated, of course. We are not always our best selves, but I believe that for most folks, the small annoyances fade to the background as we call to mind all the ways they have shaped us for the better. But then there are the people in our lives who are a little more complex. The ones who were difficult to deal with, the ones who left unfinished business, the ones who hurt us unintentionally or intentionally, the ones we could not or maybe should not forgive. My stepfather, Matt, was one of those people. In some ways, his death closed a few wounds, but it left others open with no clear path towards healing, which is why, in late 2005, I found myself at that student counseling center asking if I could start seeing a therapist. When my stepfather died, we hadn't spoken for a couple years. Our estrangement began when I came out. He wanted me to go to conversion therapy, and to her immense credit, my mother said, absolutely not. She actually had more choice words to say, but I'll not repeat those here. And since they were already divorced, there was really no reason for me to see him anymore, which in some ways made a lot of sense, and in other ways was strange because he had stepped into the role of dad for over a decade of my life. Matt was the one who taught me guy stuff, like how to tie a tie or shave my beard or put on cologne. He was the one who sat down to chat with me about puberty and did his best to talk about sex, even though he severely missed the mark with what information would be relevant to my adult life. He was always there to provide direction and always showed up to celebrate my accomplishments. But he was also mercurial. He was prone to fits of intense rage. He could be cruel and he could be domineering. And for most of my childhood, I was very scared of him. And so I learned to make myself small, to avoid attention, to maintain peace at all costs. As children, we are taught that ideally, estrangement ends with reconciliation. First, the one who has done wrong seeks repentance. Then, the one who was wronged offers forgiveness. I think about the exchange that's facilitated by a parent or a teacher between two children on the playground. The adult says, "Say you're sorry," and the child says, "Sorry." Then the adult says, "And what do you say back?" And the other child says, "I forgive you." And this seemingly simple give and take is what we call, in Judaism, the process of teshuvah, which literally means to return, but is probably better thought of as returning to the best of who we are by repairing what we have broken. But we all know that it's more complicated than just saying, "I'm sorry." In his Laws of Teshuvah, the medieval philosopher Maimonides outlines several intermediary steps between action and absolution. First, we must recognize that what we did was wrong. As my therapist says, awareness is the beginning of change. And then we have to stop doing it. Second, we have to confess out loud that what we did was wrong. Third, we evaluate the impact of our actions and make amends. And fourth, we don't do it again. And so what about the person who was wronged? What are they supposed to be doing during this process? Maimonides writes, it is forbidden for that individual to be ill-natured and unforgiving. After the wrongdoer has sought forgiveness and been rebuffed 3 times, he teaches that the fault is actually no longer theirs, but belongs to the person who was unwilling to accept their apology. Now, Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, in her book on repentance and repair, writes that Maimonides was probably concerned with the way that holding grudges can negatively impact our emotional and spiritual well-being. But she clarified in an interview about her book that even if the person who apologizes has done the deep work of repentance and has become a different person, the harmed person does not owe them forgiveness. Our tradition teaches that it is good to forgive, but there are circumstances where it's not always possible. So what do we do when teshuvah is no longer an option, where we can neither seek repentance nor offer forgiveness? Now, death is not the only closed door to reconciliation, and I say this recognizing that there are some relationships that should not be mended. But death is a firmly shut one. After someone dies, they no longer have the ability to change. There is no restitution for the harm that they have caused. They certainly can't say that they are sorry, and there's no way to say, "I forgive you," in return. Of Maimonides' Laws of Teshuvah, the only one ensured after death is that they won't do it again. But just because it won't happen again doesn't mean that we who bore the brunt of their behavior don't continue to carry the consequences of their mistakes. I was struck by a verse that we read in the Torah just now, a few words buried in the second of the 10 Commandments, which prohibits idolatry. Ki Anochi Adonai Elohecha, for I am Adonai your God, El Kana, an impassioned God. Poked Avon Avot Albanim, Al Shilashim, Al Ribeim L'Sonai, who will visit the sins of parents upon their children, upon the 3rd and the 4th generations of those who hate me. To bear punishment for the wrongdoing of those who came before us seems incredibly unfair. Yet we know this is how the world works. This is true on the macro level. As the world warms and the foundations of democracy crumble around us, it will be the job of each successive generation to make amends for the shortcomings of their ancestors. And we also know this is true on the micro level. For those of us who are marked by the wounds of others' mistakes, we know that the pain inflicted in a relationship does not end when that relationship ends. So are we always destined to become conduits of the bad behavior of those who came before us? Reflecting back on the verse that we just read, Maimonides offers a fairly bleak view. Actions have consequences, he says. And if the person who has done wrong doesn't seek restitution, someone else will need to pay that balance on their behalf. I thought about this often when I began to make therapy a weekly practice. It seemed so unfair that I was living in the shadow of someone else, someone who wasn't even in my life anymore, and that it was on me and my time and my effort and my energy to find a way through that darkness. Justice, it seems, would see the wrongdoer bearing sole responsibility for teshuvah, not passing it along to the victims of their poor choices. But that's the whole point of the verse, writes the medieval commentator Avraham ibn Ezra. We are not simply the passive recipients of wrongdoing, forced to bear this harm forever, but individuals empowered to change ourselves and the cycles of behavior we have inherited. So when I was studying to be a social worker, I became very interested in family systems theory. Some of you might be familiar with it in this room. Developed by Dr. Murray Bowen in the late 1950s, he proposed that we can look at a family as a system of interrelated parts. And I actually think in this case, we can think very expansively about how to define a family. A family is any group of people with particular roles and rules, some stated explicitly and some covertly understood. The behavior of one person affects all others who are forced to adapt accordingly. And so the goal, Bowen taught, is to make people systems experts who can recognize, disrupt, and heal unhealthy patterns within a family unit. Or, in the words of Ibn Ezra, the opportunity for teshuvah is not contained only within the life or lifetime of a single person. Yet lacking awareness and the will to change, the consequences of their actions will be borne, if not perpetuated, by their children, by the third and the fourth generations. This is not to say, and I think this is really important to emphasize here, this is not to say that we bear responsibility for the bad behavior of others, but it is a reminder that we are not destined to carry the consequences of it, even when reconciliation is no longer possible. Each of us has the ability to break the cycle. It will take work. It's going to take time and energy and effort, perhaps decades of it. And that may not be fair, and unfortunately, fairness was never a guarantee of being alive, which is something we should all take up with God when the time comes. But even if we cannot dictate the circumstances of our lives, change is still within our power. We can choose what we do, and thank God for that. For some of us, breaking the cycle will look like forgiving the one who caused us harm. And this is not necessarily the kind of forgiveness that needs to be offered directly to the person in question if they're still around, but more of a decision to step out from the shadow that they have cast over our lives. It is a way of saying, I refuse to live in reaction to that relationship anymore. Eva Moses Kor, who survived Auschwitz as a child, taught that this kind of forgiveness has nothing to do with forgetting about what happened or condoning wicked deeds. But, she says, everything to do with the need of the victims to be free from the pain inflicted upon them. She writes, it is a means of self-liberation and self-empowerment. Forgiveness is a way of turning away from the events of the past and the people who caused them and turning toward the possibility of our future and our future alone. But for some of us, forgiving those who did us wrong isn't possible. Perhaps because the harm was too great, or the trauma was too severe, or because the gesture of forgiveness without the person present does not feel healing. And that's okay. That's okay. As Rabbi Danya reminds us, harmed people can heal without forgiving, or at least without forgiving their wrongdoer, because I think that forgiveness can also be something that we offer ourselves, an act of patience and grace as we work to undo the cycles that have constrained us. One of the things that I have worked on in therapy was how to stop seeing the habits that I developed to navigate the relationship with my stepfather as good or bad, but rather as necessary adaptations to survive an impossible situation. And so when they do manifest in and disrupt my adult life, it's not that they are wrong, it's just that I don't really need them anymore. And so if you know me, you know that I have a very soft space in my heart for Marie Kondo. Truly. I appreciate the way she approaches clutter without judgment, how she recognizes that the objects that crowd our homes once served a purpose, even if that purpose was a momentary lapse of judgment and a bit of irresponsible indulgence. And so like a well-loved and well-stained t-shirt or the sweatshirt that looked amazing at the store but less amazing at home, I found myself looking at the habits of making myself small and avoiding conflict, of maintaining peace at the cost of my own well-being and saying, hey, I understand where you come from, and I'm grateful for how you helped me make it through a really hard time. But I don't need you anymore. I don't need you right now. Letting go of what was once important but no longer serves us can be its own kind of teshuvah, allowing us to shed the past so that we can turn toward who we might become in the future, a person of our own choosing. And in the space that remains after we let go of old habits, we have the opportunity to create new patterns, new ways of behaving. Because there's actually another verse that follows the one we read earlier, one that says, Ve'oseh chesed la'alafim la'ohavai u'leshomer mitzvot, that God will show kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my ways. While we may have inherited the consequences of things done by those who are no longer here, we have the ability to refuse this bequest and create something new to give to those around us, something that's much more powerful, much more enduring, much more alive than pain, which is love. Love, of course, for each other, but above all, for ourselves. To choose compassion where another was cruel, or to create safety where another caused harm. And in the place of estrangement, to find ourselves in the embrace of community, one that we have chosen and helped to create. Because here, in this family, you're not alone. Shabbat Shalom.